Engineer James Mwangi, registered consulting engineer. This is the highest license that's given by the Engineers Board of Kenya. It means that you can be a consultant not just in the country, but in very many other jurisdictions where there's complementarity, you can also be a consulting engineer. Now, engineer, you've developed the LPG standards. I mean, you've sat in those meetings and in the committees that have developed this. Just let's deal with the basics. When we have cooking gas in our homes, take us through the journey that gas has taken to actually get to our home.
Good, thank you very much. And let me start by saying that the choice of the country from where you have taken this proverb has an abundance of crude oil. And there are other African countries that have crude oil, key amongst them even Nigeria. We have crude oil in our country, but perhaps it is still resting underground and has not yet been exploited. But this is such a critical resource of energy, as we know today. It is said that the energy we use in our country, probably somewhere in the region of 20%, comes from petroleum. Amongst the products that are from petroleum is obviously gas. And gas comes from that crude oil when it goes through what we call a refining process. And there are other obviously notable products that come out of that process, key amongst them what we use for vehicles, diesel, super. We have LPG. We have other products such as petrochemicals that make plastics, etc. Remembering that our country at one time actually had a refinery, but that was closed down a couple of years ago. So we are net importers of this product. So it goes through that process, it is refined, and at the top, what we call the top end of the lighter products is LPG. Now, the two key types of LPGs that we have that find their way to domestic markets or domestic consumption is either what we call propane, which is a lighter gas, or butane. And so that there is clarity of what we import in this country, there is actually a standard, again, developed by the Kenya Bureau of Standards. So we bring into this country what we call butane, which is a mixture of that butane, 80% or thereabouts, and 20% propane. Now, the importance of specifying that ratio is that it has a bearing on the kind of safety required, the kind of pressures required of the system and the containers that will be used in the storage and transportation of LPG. Mm-hmm. So it is imported, and it comes into the port. It is offloaded from a vessel, a marine vessel. It goes into an import storage facility. So, and once it is there in the tanks, then these product is then put onto trucks. Some years ago, there was provision for LPG being put in rail wagons that came up the rail system, what we call the meter gauge. Of course, right now we have the standard gauge, but currently the standard gauge is not used to haul or ferry LPG. So it's mainly trucking. And once it comes into upcountry, granted that there's also consumption within Mombasa and the coastal region. Once it gets into Nairobi and upcountry, it will then be discharged into a storage tank system. And then that will then, for most of its use, end up being filled in cylinders. These cylinders are branded. They have a name against it, which is a requirement of the law. And I'll probably come back to it, why that is important. So it gets into cylinders, and then the cylinders are distributed. They are carried in vehicles, and they should actually be carried in a safe, and normally we say upright manner, all the way to where it ultimately gets retailed. That means it is sold now to the customer. And currently we have systems where people go collect, or we have systems where companies actually bring that gas to your home. And there has been known LPG now to be brought to your home, and you can actually consume as you pay. So we have that is trying to address the lower levels of our society in terms of affordability. Now, along that whole process is obviously the need for safety, and I think safety is paramount throughout. So the way that product is carried, it is handled, stored, etc., is covered not only by the standards but the legislation. And we have a key piece of legislation, which is what we call Legal Notice 100, that operationalize the LPG aspects as contained in the Petroleum Act 2019. And therefore, what we have seen is an increase in consumption. You remember recently the government actually removed VAT from LPG, all geared towards making it affordable.
Yeah.
We are still obviously not quite up the mark in terms of per capita consumption of LPG. And that is important for us to look at and increase so that we reverse the impacts of deforestation. And also, we have a growing middle class in our country. And this is a very convenient and much cleaner process or way of actually cooking your food, stroke heating, etc. But it's mainly used for cooking.
Okay.
So that's what I can say. Along that line also, in order to enhance consumption of LPG and to allow the consumer, especially for the LPG cylinder market, many years ago, the government came up with a policy where they standardized the valve on the cylinder. Now, the intention of that was to allow the consumer to have options so that you're not tied to a particular brand per se.
Yeah.
And in so doing, probably have efficiency and also have competitiveness, etc. Unfortunately, it also opened a window for others to get into the market in the form of them filling cylinders that belong to other brand owners. The why we have brand owners is that the cylinder actually belongs to the brand owner.
Okay.
And when you actually go in and buy, it's really putting a deposit for taking away that cylinder for you to go use it.
So it's not a purchase.
No.
It's like a license.
Yes.
It's
You
a
have
lease.
bought. Yes, I've allowed you to go with my cylinder. You've put a deposit.
Okay.
When you bring it back, I will give you back your money. And that way, it's a very important mechanism in as far as ensuring then that the responsibility of the safety of that cylinder rests with the brand owner. And when these cylinders come into the filling plants, they must go through a series of checks even before you refill it. And those are important because in the absence of that, then you probably are exposing the consumer or the user to great risk. And even after the filling, it goes through another series of risks, key amongst them to check whether it is leaking. And in the event it is leaking, it is decanted. The LPG is removed and the cylinder is repaired. And lastly, with the brand owner, whether or not this cylinder has a problem, it must go through what we call revalidation at their cost. They must go and check that cylinder again in an established and recognized facility that takes these cylinders through another series of checks at least once every 8 years. And what happens is that when you go through that revalidation process, there is a date stamped on that cylinder. So if you go home today and that date has exceeded 8 years, then that cylinder is actually out of compliance in as far as the safety is concerned.
Engineer,
Yes.
I smile because I'm left to wonder. These are not fantasies. They're not things that somebody suggested at some point. They're actually regulations that are meant to be followed. They are documented, and there's an agreement that folks who are entering into this business then agree that they are going to actually carry out should they be doing the refilling and the leasing essentially of these canisters. Is it not?
Yeah.
Okay. And people know this?
You know, the one thing I can say is that the legislation is very, very clear.
Okay.
It's always a question of the level of awareness. The person who opts to get into the LPG business, it is their cardinal responsibility to make sure that they understand the business that they're going into, and what defines the boundaries of that business. And the question is whether people take time to understand this. And in the absence of them understanding, then we have a mechanism of enforcement. So to get into this business, you are licensed because you demonstrate through paperwork, whether it is your documentation, your designs, etc., and you want to construct, that you have the ability, capacity to do that.
Okay.
And then once you take it through the construction, somebody will come and check, does it comply? And that includes the fact that those who design are licensed and are deemed to be capable, because it is their name on the line in the event that they do it wrongly. And then during the life of that facility, there is a licensing process and a review mechanism in as far as audits. You'll hear of safety audits. You'll hear of environmental audits. So that during the life of this facility, it conforms to the requirements of the law.
But then I have to ask that. So we talk about branding, and so we see the branded canisters. We know who those are, and so that would make sense in line with what you're saying. But then over the last few years, we've seen the mushrooming of many unbranded canisters that people are buying and using in their homes. What essentially does this mean? I mean, they're unbranded. I mean, they come in all kinds of colors. You buy it so long as it's gas, right? In whatever measure it is that you're purchasing, you take it to your house and you go along. Does this mean then that these unbranded canisters that we're seeing have not gone through these checks or regulations that you're talking about?
Good question. Firstly, the canisters, I believe, have all got a brand. It's just that the brand may not be very recognized.
It's not a known brand.
Yes, but you'll find it has a name. And then the color is meant to easily distinguish who this belongs to, etc. Now, your question is very, very important, because the malpractice that has been reported is where a brand belonging to a certain company, who has that responsibility, as I explained, is then filled by somebody who doesn't, who is not the owner of the brand, or is not authorized by the brand owner. And this is where we have probably one of the biggest challenges, which then means if company A buys cylinders and brings them into the market, and by investing in that cylinder, they expected to do certain number of returns for them to be able to sell that LPG and recover their money and obviously make a profit. If that cylinder doesn't come back to them and somebody else is refilling it, then of course it's not good business. It has been reported that there is a huge percentage of the cylinders that are not actually filled by the brand owners. What does that mean? That there is no kind of guarantee that it has gone through the safety checks that I was talking about. And that the 8-year period, because nobody is meant to refill that cylinder if it has not gone through that mandatory revalidation. It then means that the user is exposed to because the person maybe has not taken responsibility in terms of safety. Number 3 is that in the event there is an incident and you have no proof to show that you actually brought this from somebody who's authorized by the brand owner or the brand owner himself, something happens, the brand owner will not take liability of that explosion, etc. So there has been, because why I brought up the issue of the standard valve is because it has made it easy. That means
it's
whichever
open market.
Yes, previously everybody had a unique valve. Then which meant that if you buy this from brand owner A, now you'll just have to go with them.
It can only go back to brand owner A to be refilled.
So his price or her price is what you'll go by. So there was no competitiveness. But this is one of the areas that we find is of concern. And let me read what the regulation says, because of the seriousness of doing this. In the what we call the legal notice number 100, Schedule 5, or 5th schedule, It says refilling, trading, or rebranding of cylinders without the brand owner's consent. The penalty stroke fine is now defined in terms of not less. And it says here 10 million shillings.
So the minimum fine is 10 million shillings.
Yes. The question is, why is it then still happening if there's such a strong penalty?
Enforcement.
So we get into problems now of getting this person.
For you to find them, you've got to catch them, take them to court, prove that they are not authorized and that you found them in the illegal business, and then they're found guilty and then fined the 10.
That is the course of the law.
Okay.
Yes.
Engineer James Mwangi is a registered consulting engineer. He's our guest this morning. He understands very many things, 10 or 20 or 40 things about the LPG business in the country. He's told us that he's been involved in drafting of regulations and also advising on laws to be made to govern the LPG business in the country. He's taking us through. So when we see all these illegal filling plants and we are told they're illegal, what does it mean? Engineer, you've told us when every gas business in this country, first of all, must be registered, get into regulation. If you have a cylinder, then that cylinder must be registered with you. And colors are just to distinguish so that everybody can just tell from far. That's Total Gas, that is K-Gas by Rubies, that is Galana Energies, Del Gas, and so on and so forth. But all of them have similar valve. But then it's required, it's expected that once this gas is finished, that whole system, the distribution system, is going to end up with an empty K-Gas cylinder going back to K-Gas to be refilled and back into the market. That Total are not going to be refilling K-Gas, right? But then there's those unscrupulous people who are not branded, who are like shadowy, unknown, who will take all these gases and go and start refilling. And when they're doing that, they skip very many processes that are required by law. Checks and tests and confirmations and even weight. So when you're buying a 13 kg gas cylinder from these unscrupulous people who are doing these things back room, you may be getting a 9 kg thing.
Right.
Whereas Total or Delgas or K-Gas or any of these other branded ones, if they went back to those operations, they'd have made sure that it's a 13 because they have a responsibility for it. So how do we end up here with these unscrupulous people? And how are they doing it?
Let's just say that it shows that this is a critical business in this country for people to have that level of interest. The fact that you have this particular feature on the cylinder that makes it easy to fill in somebody else's cylinder or to fill any cylinder obviously is enticing. The business has been growing and is set to even grow further as the population increases and as people come up with new business model, marketing models, etc. So I think the rain started beating us when it became easy for you to fill in somebody else's cylinder. And at the time when this took place, the legislation to try and guide this was not quite in place. So you have a policy that was ahead of the legislation that would have then operationalized this effectively. Now, the other thing that has been important is that then the regulations have also come in. We now have the Petroleum Act in 2019, which is a more robust piece of legislation. And then, of course, the LPG regulations, like I said. So that has now come in to try and address the impact of having that unified valve and having that significant growth in demand, because that significant growth in demand means it's a business opportunity, etc. So what happened is that I think where we always find ourselves having a challenge is the capacity to go out there and ensure that we are effectively looking at these facilities. But even before we go there, the person who is going into this business, the level of awareness. I remember initially many years ago, those who were caught in a malpractice, you take them to court and then you say he was violating what standard?
Yeah.
It didn't exist. But now, of course, we have progressed significantly. So what we're saying is that even all effort of enforcement through government agencies, etc., must be supplemented by what I would call self-regulation. And this means having business membership organizations, etc., for specific players such as this, to first of all give them awareness, take their staff for training, etc., because you can go around looking at these facilities. When it disappears here, it pops up somewhere else, etc. The other thing is that perhaps our culture is also got something to do with it, where we aren't too concerned about the safety of the person or the customer that we are having. And what I find very sad, and this is demonstrated by road accidents, is that they never stop. You can have 10 people losing their life today, or 20. It comes up and then it never disappears. It comes again, etc. So there is awareness that is key, so that these people who want to go into this business, nobody is saying don't go into business, but they're saying if you choose to go into this business, these are the requirements. Now, to come to the next point is that there are different government agencies involved in this process. There is a person who will approve the location where you want to have this facility, the zoning, etc.
Who's that?
How conversant are they with the dangers of such facilities in as far as the location is concerned? If you look today, this country has over 4,000 petrol stations, and that's a good thing because they're trying to reach out there, bring some level of competition in terms of service, etc. But sometimes we must always ask ourselves, where are they located? So there's one, the level of competence and skill of the person who is saying, I accept or I approve you to be located here. And this is where development plans of a town or a city, etc., come into play, because these things should be predetermined to a good extent. If you look today, the petroleum facilities are in an industrial area, most of them. And if you look at them, they are close to each other. What is the advantage of that? Is that you kind of confine that big risk in a certain area. Number two, it allows you to have some level of synergy and collaboration when this incident, if it came up in terms of firefighting facilities, competences to fight that firefighting facilities, the capacity and ability of emergency services to get to that location. You can imagine if it is all over the place, even the location to go and fight that fire is probably not to a level that you would expect. So zoning first. Zoning also goes with the sizing. In LPG, the key thing is safety. It's distance. We call it spacing.
Distance from what to what?
Let's start with the facility itself. Where the tank is and where the truck fills, there's a certain minimum distance that you must meet. Remember, a truck has got an exhaust. That is quite hot, although there are features that we put onto them. So there is spacing, and that is all contained in the standard. So you can't go and put a tank next to the office, next to where the cylinders are being filled. Spacing to allow gas, if it escapes, to dilute to the level that it doesn't spark easily. That's the whole concept or philosophy behind it. So there is spacing. So the size. So the person who's coming up with that design must be competent. And we need his signature and his stamp so that we can hold this person accountable.
Should anything happen. Right.
Then after that, there is that zoning. There is obviously, we have the regulator who will look at the requirements from an engineering standpoint from these regulations. We have also NEMA that is also meant to come in and say, in as far as matters environment, how do you address this? And you put in a proposal, you use the right expert, because people may have a tendency of just taking materials previously done and just banging it into a report, etc. And then we, after NEMA, we have DOSH, the Directorate of Occupational Health and Safety. They say, okay, we need a fire permit. You need to show us your firefighting plan, etc. But obviously the overall regulator is EPRA. And you have seen that there are many instances where they have turned down these licenses. But the question is, it still springs up and it still goes ahead. It then means that those who do that do not feel that this is a threat enough. And that's where they feel they can go and still go ahead. And that's wrong.
Or is there a prescribed chronology of how these licenses should be applied? And overall, because the overall license shall come from EPRA, is EPRA aware when you are going to the local authorities to ask for location permits, when you are going to NEMA to ask for environment permits, when you are going to the safety to seek for the safety permit? Can they stop it from the very beginning and say, come on?
Actually, they do. If you look at the case of the environmental impact assessment, when it is submitted to NEMA, one copy must go to EPRA. And EPRA will make their comments on that study that has been submitted. And they are free. And I'm aware that they have previously gone out and said, we don't accept this. So that then tells NEMA, because they are specialized, tells NEMA that this regulator is saying this report does not meet certain requirements. But when it comes to the building service and zoning, I do not think there is provision for that to be sent to EPRA. I stand there to be guided. But the goodness right now is that we have portals. So if you look at the list of documentation expected to be submitted, there's a whole long list. And the beauty of it is that it goes to the extent that you want to know who is this individual, who is this company, the CR12, all these very pertinent details. And you then upload all these reports, licenses. Places like NEMA, a license is issued with conditions. And so even EPRA will be able to see it is issued subject to the following things being done. And therefore, when this facility is done, there's a construction permit, then there's a licensing, where they are also meant to check, have you done what you should have actually done? I think the biggest issue is that they are far and wide. There are many, like I said. And remember that EPRA is a regulator, but the prosecution comes through another government agency, etc. And I'm just saying that perhaps there's need to enhance collaboration, and also for professionals, engineers like myself and others, going in there and actually looking and saying, hey, this is actually, it may have been approved this way, and then probably over time there has been modification, deterioration, and things like that. So supporting in terms of the technical aspects of checking compliance requirements, etc.
City.
The thing that I find particularly interesting with this discussion is just one thing. It's argued that some of our laws are not stringent enough, but how much more do we want them to be stringent, really? And why must our laws of necessity bring about fear in order for them to be obeyed? What is it about us and our great need to disregard laws? Because it is that the laws don't exist. The conversation that in my mind we are preoccupied with is the ability and the means by which we can circumvent these laws. There's a book I'm reading still. It's called Why Nations Fail. And one of the observations that these writers have is that many African nations have very, very good laws. But what these laws do is that they bring about more corruption. Because if you have stringent laws with huge fines, what you've actually done is opened a huge door to even further corruption. Like when you mentioned the 10 million, I was thinking, okay, someone will flaunt the law, knows they're going to flaunt the law. They know there is the fine that they're likely to be charged. But the person who comes to enforce the law then gives you a plan B and says, if you wish to avert this outcome that you're now facing, perhaps you and I can have a conversation. So it simply broadens the conversation. It doesn't reduce the likelihood of more occurrence of the same. So are we then therefore saying that if we look at where the bulk of our population is, and we look at the places from where they have been getting their gas for domestic use, are we saying that it is by God's good grace that we haven't had domestic disasters on a large scale, or the problem that we're having? Because the bulk of these people are served by the very, very individuals that we're saying may not necessarily be licensed and may not necessarily be adhering to these norms.
Yeah. Maybe let me start by saying that we don't want to have a blanket condemnation coming from your comment, because there are those who are actually licensed. The question is whether they then practice in alignment to the requirements of the law. But the point that you also bring is that they are playing a very important role in making sure that these gas actually, there is a higher penetration of this gas in as far as availability to the user. So if you go to, I went to my village one time a couple of years ago, and I was actually very surprised to see cylinders there, freely sold, and I thought, hey, this is good. Gas is there. And I also learned that the cost of the alternative, which is firewood, was actually higher. And so people are beginning to change. So they have played a very important role. The question, because they also are able to go to places where maybe certain companies would not find to be commercially viable. It's a small little village, and they may not find it to be commercially viable. So, but the comment that you make is very valid, because it's not the absence of the laws, actually. The laws are actually there. But I think it goes back to the fabric of our value system, in as far as feeling that I am responsible for the person that I'm actually serving, to the extent that I take what I believe are measures to protect this customer of mine, and that I have a relationship and I have an obligation to look after this customer. But the truth be said is that is something that we still need to look at. I don't think it is impossible to do. I also think that as we go along, there are people who we are advised started off perhaps doing business in the not correct way, and they became then victims of the same model. So you go and you decide, now I have capacity to get to the level where now I can do legitimate business and I can have a distribution system. And then perhaps you find yourself confronted with the same problem. But I can say this, that perhaps the proliferation of these facilities means they're trying to serve a certain market and penetrate. But it is possibly, very possible, for us to be looking at bigger storage facilities that have larger economies of scale, which then even reduces the what I would call the filling charges, ETC. And these facilities, just like today we have a company like Kenya Pipeline, which in Western Kenya, for those of us who are in this industry for many years, saw a complete change when they went to Western Kenya and offered people these facilities. Then the need for having smaller depots were not found to be there. It found itself more convenient. You take your truck, you have fuel in the system, you take a truck, you get loaded, and you go wherever you want. So we need to look and see, how do we have economies of scale? Because if we have these larger facilities that allow people to just take your cylinders, then let people compete in the distribution system.
Sure.
And then perhaps that would solve one part of the problem. But the issue of that brand, if we come back to it, that would still be something that needs to be addressed. But we have more cylinder manufacturing facilities in the country. So it's not that we don't have that capacity. Oh, by the way, lastly, is the consumer. The awareness and education of the consumer
Indeed.
will also have a very important bearing.
Sure, I think there are many questions that come up, especially from the consumer side of things, where you're asking yourself, all right, well, I bought a canister of gas, it should have lasted me X period of time, it didn't, and then things like that start to pop up in terms of, all right, so was this then filled at a facility whereby all the requirements and the standards had been kept and upheld? So those questions come into play. And then linked to, in terms of the bodies that are tasked with oversight on all of these things that we speak of today, so it takes into consideration everybody, do they have enough capacity to go through and through to make sure that everything is up to scratch? Because we have mushrooming backwoods, I don't know where somebody has we don't even know where they are today. We unfortunately hear about them when there's a disaster. Is there enough?
Yeah. Let me first of all, before I answer your question, just go back to that feeling, because we have seen companies have special seals, okay, special seals, so that you can know right from the word go, this actually came from company X. We have technology coming in that can now track these cylinders in terms of their numbers, etc. So technology is also going to help. In terms of what you've asked, madam, obviously capacity. How far do you regulate? And I'm happy what the gentleman here said. How far can you regulate? Do you have one policeman per person or two? So it's still something that we need to do in terms of capacity and awareness. But self-regulation still has a very big role to play and awareness.
So the Petroleum Institute of East Africa,
Yes.
which is a business membership organization that brings together all these petroleum marketing companies, has a lot more to do here in ensuring that we don't have many cases of this.
Yeah, actually, they have done a lot in this industry. But it started off as one. Now we have more. We have more business membership organizations.
Yes.
I sit on the board of KEPSA, and I'm aware that there are quite a number. And they and it's okay. You have transporters, you have big players, smaller players, etc. So the increase in those business membership means for you to be there, you must agree to certain norms, etc. But they have played a big role. They are certainly a role model to the others in terms of driving agenda, etc. And
Okay.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.